meeting of the London Assembly Housing Committee. Can I remind everyone in the room, which is not very many people today, to turn off your phones and put them on silent, and also to all the guests who are online, please please mute yourself while you're not speaking. That will help everybody. Members of the public watching this, we're still broadcasting online, may like to follow London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag London Housing for this meeting. Now, today's meeting has been convened by me informally. This allows the committee members and all the guests to join virtually because of concerns about crowding this room. And so this will be an informal meeting, but it's still being broadcast and we'll still be publishing the transcript later on. The main item on today's agenda is our investigation into overcrowding in housing in London. We have some very short items of business. First, we'll not make any formal decisions today, but for transparency, we'll still declare our interests and we'll note some items. So can I ask our clerk now, Diane Richards, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. No apologies for absence have been received. In accordance with Standing Order 8.2, Assembly Member Sheikh is attending the meeting as an observer.
Thank you very much. And can we also now note in the declaration of interest part of the informal agenda the list of offices held by Assembly members, and can I ask if anyone has any further disclosable pecuniary interests on any items in today's agenda? No, that's everything. Thank you very much. Can we also, under summary list of actions, note the completed, closed and outstanding actions arising from previous meetings of the committee and the additional correspondence we've sent to previous guests?
Yes.
Thank you very much, committee. And then can we also note the responses from the Mayor of London to our letters on retrofitting London's housing stock and on homes for women leaving prison?
Noted.
Thank you very much. Right, well, that brings us today to our main item for discussion, which is overcrowding in London. I want to welcome all our guests and thank them for joining us virtually today. We have with us Tom Copley, who's the Deputy Mayor for Housing and Residential Development. With him, we have James Gleeson, who is the Housing Research and Analysis Manager for the GLA. Also from outside the GLA, now we have Charles True, who is the Head of Policy at Shelter. Thank you very much for coming. We have Beatrice Amir Sintho-Taylor, the Head of Housing Needs at the London Borough of Harrow. Thank you very much for joining us, Beatrice. We have Hakeem Osinaiki, the Operational Director of Housing, London Borough of Brent, and Jamie Carswell, the Director of Housing and Safer Communities at the Royal Borough of Greenwich. Thanks to all our guests for coming. The Deputy Mayor, Tom Copley, unfortunately has told us that he has to leave after the first hour, and I'm very sorry, Tom, that the Assembly Committee meeting turned out in the end to be a bit inconvenient for you. We're very sad that you can't stay for the whole meeting, and we hope you'll be able to attend a further one, and we'll probably follow up with some more questions in writing if we can't put them to you later from issues arising later in the agenda. Because of that, we're going to focus our initial questions on Tom and his team, and that will be for the first hour of the meeting. So apologies to other guests if you've got things you want to bring in later on that draws upon some of the things that Tom and his team say. I'd be really happy to have you come back later on, so please take a note. Right, so moving on to our questions now. I will start by speaking to Tom and to James. And if you can tell us what you believe in your policy work is some of the main causes of overcrowding in London.
Thank you very much, Chair. And yes, apologies, I can only be here for the first hour, but I'm very happy to follow up to any letters, of course, that you wish to write, and with any further questions. And this is a really important topic, and I, remember from my days when I was a local councillor in Lewisham, some of the worst sort of casework that one receives as a councillor is from people living in overcrowded situations, particularly people who are living in overcrowded and temporary accommodation, for example, really facing the brunt of the housing crisis that we need to resolve. And we have unfortunately seen an increase in overcrowding during coronavirus. It went up in London from about 8% going into the pandemic. And I should add, disproportionately affecting BAME Londoners and Londoners living in the private rented sector and the social rented sector. Increased up to about 15% before falling back slightly to about 12%. So that sort of gives you a picture of the situation that we're in, sadly exacerbated by coronavirus. And of course, overcrowding itself exacerbating coronavirus, people being cooped up in overcrowded situations, increasing the transmission of COVID. And I suppose I would touch on two main drivers of this. First of all, of course, the lack of available housing and the fact that we have a housing crisis, the fact that London and indeed the country have not been building the homes that we need for so long. And of course, the Mayor has been working hard to try and rectify that on the affordable housing side, record affordable housing starts under his 2016 to 23 programme. And indeed his new 2021 to 26 programme will have a focus, thankfully, on social housing, which of course is the most affordable kind of affordable housing, which will benefit those people who are who are overcrowded and who need low cost social rented housing. So we have to sort out the issue on the housing side. I also think that what the Mayor is doing through his Right to Buy Back programme will be of considerable benefit to overcrowded households as well. A lot of the interest from councils in the Right to Buy Back programme, which is of course allowing councils to buy back homes that they were forced to sell under the right to buy, and the fact that councils were forced to sell these homes in the first place is one of the key drivers of why councils are now having to rely on private sector temporary accommodation. Being able to buy these homes back will allow councils to house people in much better temporary accommodation and hopefully less overcrowded temporary accommodation than they would have been able to. And much of the interest from boroughs in buying back these homes has been to use as temporary accommodation, better temporary accommodation for their residents. So there's key things that need to be addressed on the housing side. But of course, we cannot get away from the fact that a lot of families are overcrowded because they can't afford to live in the size of flat that they need. And a lot of that is a product of the welfare system and the cuts and the caps that we have seen introduced in particular since 2010. So families being forced into homes that are much smaller than they would need for their family size. And that's why the Mayor has been lobbying particularly around the benefit cap, and we've seen a big increase in London, the number of people affected by the benefit cap during the pandemic, as well as other reforms as well, particularly around the cap that was introduced on the number of children you can claim child benefit for. All of these caps and all of these restrictions on welfare that we have seen under austerity since 2010 have been key drivers of overcrowding.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom. You mentioned there data that you said that the amount of overcrowding had gone up to 15% and then come back down again during the pandemic. How are you measuring overcrowding, first of all? What's the measure that you use to determine what is an overcrowded household, and how are you monitoring that by getting data?
So the key measure that's used is the bedroom standard, which of course has been around for I think quite a long time now, since the 1960s, used as the key indicator of overcrowding. I might just pass over to James Gleeson just to sort of go through and talk about where the specific figures that I mentioned are from. So hopefully James can fill you in on that.
Yes, thank you, Tom. The data that Tom mentioned comes largely from the English Housing Survey and related research by the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities. So the figures for the pre-pandemic period come from the English Housing Survey itself. And then during the pandemic itself, the department published a series of sort of snapshot surveys using a similar methodology and a similar sample to the English Housing Survey, but with a much faster turnaround. And it did 3 waves of these snapshot surveys, and the first figures on overcrowding came from the second wave, which were for November, December 2020. And they showed that increase in London in the percentage of households that were overcrowded, according to the bedroom standard, from 8% before the pandemic to 15% at that point. And the third snapshot survey was carried out in April-May 2021, and that showed a bit of a decrease, so back down to about 12%, but still higher than the pre-pandemic period.
Okay, that's useful to know. Now, the English Housing Survey, as I understand it, does not give data by borough. It doesn't give breakdowns for different ages of people. It doesn't give breakdowns for different groups of Londoners. Is that correct? And is there anything that you're planning to do to get more accurate, more actionable data that gives us more of a picture? At the moment, I think we just get a number for London, as far as I know.
Yes, in the past, we did, I believe, have that those borough figures, but we haven't had those collected for a number of years. And I'm not quite clear, I'm afraid, whether or not that data stopped being collected for methodological reasons or for financial reasons. One thing, of course, that we will be getting later this year will be the new census data, which will be an important new set of data that will give us a bit more of an up-to-date picture on what's happening on overcrowding. My slight caution on the census data is, of course, it was conducted at a very strange time when, of course, lots of people had moved around. Quite a few people had moved out of London. So although it will be interesting to see what that data says, I suppose there should be a little bit of a health warning attached to it. It might have been slightly better had that census taken place in England this year, as I believe it is in Scotland, in light of the fact that the situation was quite odd because of the pandemic. I don't know if James wants to add anything on the borough level data or sources of borough level data that there might be.
Yeah, thank you. Just to add on the figures that Tom referred to first. So in, I think it was 2008 and then 2009, the department, which was then called the Department for Communities and Local Government, sponsored a question on a major national survey called the Integrated Household Survey that had such a big sample that it was able to give reasonably robust estimates at the local authority level. The department stopped doing that in, I think, 2010-11. I don't know whether that was for cost reasons or methodological reasons, but basically that data stopped being available at that point. And just to add on the English Housing Survey, you're right, Chair, that the data isn't available then to local authority level because the sample just isn't big enough. We can do some analysis by age and by certain other variables, but the spatial level at which the results are available only goes down to region.
Okay, thank you very much. That's all really clear. Thank you. So to Tom then, given that we've relied heavily on the census before, and that gives us data which we can use, for 10 years. Given the problems that there are with the current census that's about to come out, and these long-standing issues with the reduced sample size and the English Housing Survey, have you not tried to do anything to fix that at a London level, at a strategic level? Isn't that something that's really your job? And would you think about doing that?
I think it's something that could be considered, looking at our own data, but of course there would be a cost to the GLA of that. And I think my view would be really the government ought to be collecting this data and doing it properly and doing it nationally as they used to. And as James mentioned, I think really that would be the right way to do this. I'm always open to exploring ways in which the GLA could potentially collect more data. But as I say, that comes with a significant cost at a time of restricted budgets. And of course, I think probably to make it worthwhile, it's something that we'd have to repeat on an annual basis, thereby increasing the cost further. But I'm not saying to you absolutely not, Chair. I'm saying it's something that could potentially be explored.
Okay, thank you. That's useful. I've got two Assembly members wanting to come in to follow up on this. First of all, Assembly Member Moema.
Thank you, Chair. Morning, Tom. I've got a couple of questions for you. So we know that Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities are particularly overcrowded, and the government data demonstrates this quite clearly with differentials between Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Black and other households. And so I just wondered, what is the GLA doing to specifically help those communities that are most affected? What could they be doing?
Thanks very much for the question, Assembly Member Moema. Yes, you're absolutely right. So according to the 2011 census, for example, overcrowding rates amongst the Bangladeshi community were 36%, Pakistani community 25%. So you're seeing a wide range of variation. I think the key things that the GLA is doing, first of all, is funding is funding new affordable housing, and particularly new social housing. And as I said before, we've had record numbers of affordable housing starts through that. And in our new affordable homes program, the majority of homes being for social rent will particularly help Londoners from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds. I think that's really, really positive. Also, of course, we've seen through the London Plan setting new requirements around boroughs having size mixers to get more family-sized homes through the planning system. Again, will help to alleviate overcrowding. And of course, the right to buy back fund, as I've already mentioned, I think is going to be particularly helpful for those Londoners who find themselves trapped, often for many, many years in temporary accommodation, giving them larger and more decent homes in order to live, rather than being reliant on some of these very inferior private sector options, again, which should benefit disproportionately Black and ethnic minority Londoners.
Okay, thank you. And also, just would be interested to know just how you think overcrowding the private rented sector might have contributed to the wider issue as well.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch.
But how, from your perspective, how has overcrowding the private rented sector contributed to the wider issue of overcrowding as a whole?
Yes, so overcrowding is higher in the private rented sector than it is on average. It's around 13%. Also added to that, of course, the private rented sector has the lowest compliance with the decent homes standard of any tenure as well. So not only have you got people more likely to be living in overcrowded accommodation, you've also got that accommodation also tends to be of a lower standard. I think this really emphasises the importance of the Mayor's call to be given the power to decide whether or not boroughs can introduce landlord licensing measures. At the moment, of course, that decision is open to a veto by the Secretary of State, and unfortunately, that we've seen the Secretary of State exercise that veto against certain boroughs wishing to introduce landlord licensing schemes, which we know can help drive up standards in the private rented sector, and to prevent some of these appalling examples that we're all aware of many people being crammed into, completely inappropriately sized properties. I think, giving the mayor these powers over licensing in the private rented sector in London would be extremely beneficial. And despite the fact, of course, the mayor doesn't have powers over the private rented sector, he's taken a number of measures already, not least the property license checker and the road landlord and agent checker, to try and clamp down on some of these more unscrupulous landlords, some of whom have committed offences in housing law.
Thank you.
And I also have Assembly Member Devonish wanting to follow up on that too.
Thank you, Chair. I'm quite astounded that both the Deputy Mayor and officers have come to this meeting so poorly briefed with respect. I mean, you can say that there's a reason why the London Borough data is no longer collected, but you don't seem to know why it isn't collected. Was it an efficiency cut, or, why isn't it being collected? Can you please go away and write to the committee with the reason why it's being cut, who cut it, and then consider whether or not you would actually bring it back, because otherwise we're data blind for this meeting. Without any data, how are we measuring what you're doing?
I think perhaps your connection might be playing up, Assembly Member Devonish. We've been very clear this was data collected by the government, which the government stopped collecting. If you want to know why the data why the government stopped collecting the data, that really is a question for the government. I'd be very happy to assist you and assist the committee with that, to see if we can find ourselves the reasons why the government didn't do it, but the government stopped collecting it. But I would suggest, given this was an action taken by the government, that it's a question you should be putting to the government. But I don't know, perhaps your connection was a bit dodgy and you missed that bit.
No, I didn't miss that bit. I still think that we do devolve housing in London, and you are the Deputy Mayor. And if something isn't happening, you should be lobbying the government rather than just sort of saying, oh, it's not collected and we don't have any idea why it's not collected. That's just ridiculous. We could be on the same side on this point, Deputy Mayor, if you actually came to us with some information of what is the situation and how long has it not been collected, for example.
I mean, James Gleeson has just set that out to you, Assembly Member Devonish. It's not been collected since 2010-11. It was the government that took a decision to stop collecting it. I think it would be quite valuable, actually, to have this data brought back at a national level, and therefore it would make sense for the government to collect it.
And you're not prepared.
I appreciate that you're quite exercised and quite angry about this, Assembly Member Devonish. I suggest you're directing your anger at the wrong organisation. Perhaps you should be directing your anger at what is now called the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, rather than at the GLA. And I've already said to Assembly Member Berry, we can look at whether or not we can, obtain additional data. That will, of course, come at a cost to the GLA. It seems to make sense to me for this to be done at a national level.
I'll leave it there, Chair. I'm not going to get any further. It's always blame the government rather than actually do the job.
I don't see how the GLA can be blamed for stopping collecting data that it never collected in the first place. This was government data that the government chose to stop collecting in 2010.
Do you not believe?
So I do think that your anger may be justified, but I think it's directed at the wrong organisation.
Deputy Mayor, I'll ask you a slightly different question and I'll stop. Do you think you have all the data you need to do your job?
We've got data at a London-wide level, which is very useful. I would welcome more data if the government were to come back and decide that it was once again going to collect the data at a borough level. I think that would be quite useful. I'm sure boroughs would appreciate that as well.
And you will lobby them to do that, will you?
Yes, very happy to. And in fact, we lobby the government on a number of aspects of data collection.
Yeah.
we've informed the committee about this before in relation to the core database.
I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Assemblymember Cooper. I was about to remind members we have very little time with the Deputy Mayor here today, and going over ground more than once is probably not a good idea during this meeting. I have two further hands have gone up during the course of that discussion. As briefly as you can, please. Assemblymember Boff first.
Apologies, that was actually covered in the subsequent.
Oh, thank you so much. And as Assemblymember Cooper.
Well, mine was really a point about the previous discussion to say perhaps we could move on from it because we do seem to be kind of repeating the points. But I'm surprised that Assemblymember Devenish didn't know that a lot of the NIs, the national indicators, including a whole suite of the housing ones, stopped being collected by DCLG as it was then. And there was a vast raft of indicators that were extremely useful that we've not had now for almost 12 years. And, you know, it might be a recommendation that we put in, but it's quite a long time since these and many other indicators were stopped. So perhaps we could park that and consider that for a recommendation. But I don't think we can ask the Deputy Mayor single-handedly to re-implement the system of collecting national indicators because it goes way beyond housing indicators that were stopped. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Right, so moving on now, we have questions from Assemblymember Baker. I think you have more to ask about this issue in a slightly different fashion, I think.
Well, yeah, I don't want to cover over all ground that we have also covered, but to give the opportunity for the Deputy Mayor to add anything really. I mean, just to say that in the Affordable Housing Monitor in 2021, the committee specifically, as we've all talked about, called on the Mayor to improve the collection of data that's relevant to overcrowding pressures in London. I just want to give you an opportunity to say if there's anything else that that has been done on this, and also just asking whether specifically, obviously, it's should go without saying that the poorest in society often live in overcrowded housing, and whether there's any opportunity to collect data specific to this to really illuminate that issue.
Yes, thanks very much, Assemblymember Baker. I don't know if I've got an awful lot more to add on that point, except to say that, you know, the data is important, and I certainly would be keen to go away to look at what potentially, you know, additional data we could collect, although I do emphasize the point that it really does make sense for this to be national data, but very happy both to lobby the department to improve its data collection and to collect better data on this point at a granular level, and also whether or not you know, that subject to the cost restrictions and the budgetary restrictions that we have, whether or not we can look at collecting a bit more data. But overcrowding, it is very complicated. It's not just when it comes to surveying overcrowding, it's not just a sort of course, just a yes or no question, are you overcrowded or not? You have to have a sort of series of questions relating to people's household circumstances. So, you know, it's not it's not a sort of simple undertaking. We have to make sure that we're collecting the data properly and in a way that is, you know, that is usable and beneficial. It's certainly something that I'd be willing to look at, and you're absolutely right. This is something that affects the poorest Londoners the most. They're at the sharp end of this, and it's absolutely right that we should have a clear picture of the situation.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. So now we're moving on to some questions about what actions you're taking to deal with it, as opposed to just find out about it. Starting with Assemblymember Devenish.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning again, Deputy Mayor. What policies has the Mayor implemented to reduce overcrowding, and what has been the impact? And can you please be specific with some deliverables and some numbers, please?
Yes, of course, Assemblymember Devenish. Well, first of all, the new London plan introduces requirements for boroughs to set a size mix for affordable housing. That's very important in terms of delivering more family-sized homes for low-cost rent, which are the most needed homes at a borough level. We are, of course, as well delivering record numbers of affordable housing starts, and in fact, in 2019-20, the most starts since GLA records began in 2002, more than 17,000. Some of the rest I've touched on already. I mean, as I say, the new right to buyback fund, which allows councils to buy back the homes that they were sold under the right to buy, will enable councils to buy back much better quality homes to house people in temporary accommodation who are often overcrowded, rather than relying on some of the inferior private sector options. And we've also, on that, introduced asked boroughs to come to us where they need to house Afghan refugees. A higher rate of funding we can make available for family-sized larger homes. Of course, these homes, although initially going to Afghan refugees, subsequently will be available for all Londoners as well. So a range of things, and the key things being, of course, making sure that we increase the level of housing. But it's not just about increasing the number of family-sized homes. Increasing homes of all bedroom sizes actually helps with overcrowding because of the number. We have a lot of concealed households in London. I think more than 300,000 concealed households in London. This is where, you've got essentially two households sharing the same property. Building more homes of all sizes helps us to reduce overcrowding by helping people in concealed households move into separate and their own accommodation.
Well, we can agree for once on your work with boroughs on the Afghan refugees. I think it's an excellent programme.
Thank you.
But if you are looking at your overall record as the Mayor of London's overall record for 8 years, will overcrowding, in your view, have gone up or gone down over those 8 years?
Sorry, could you repeat that, Senator Devonish?
Sorry, my connection is not very good this morning. Will, over the 8 years, do you believe that overcrowding overall will have gone up or gone down?
So overcrowding, prior to the pandemic, Senator Devonish, overcrowding had basically sort of gone along at about the same level for quite some time. And as I said earlier, it was around 8% going into the pandemic. That, of course, then went up, as we've heard, to about 15%, dropped down to about 12% as a result of the pandemic. But in the sort of pre-pandemic world, it had kind of gone along at the same rate for quite some time. I think we have to bear in mind the external factors that are beyond the Mayor's control in terms of overcrowding. And the key one that I've touched on already is welfare and social security. If you've got caps, you've got LHA caps, if you've got a total benefit cap, if you're limiting the number of children that families can claim child benefit for to just 2, you are inevitably going to end up in a situation where people cannot afford to live in the size of property that they need to be living in based on their family size. So while all the stuff that's happening on delivering new affordable homes is crucial, we cannot get away from the fact that if we build homes and people then can't afford to live in them, we aren't going to be able to deal with the overcrowding crisis. And that's where we need action from the government on welfare.
Okay, my final question, and then I'll be quiet and let others speak. Is there anything else within your powers more that you could do to alleviate overcrowding without additional powers or money from the government?
It's a good question, Assembly Member Devonish. As far as I am aware, as far as I can tell, we are using the full suite of the Mayor's powers and the levers that are at the Mayor's disposal to alleviate overcrowding in London. That said, I think this is an important investigation by the Housing Committee, and if the Housing Committee uncovers and makes recommendations relating to things that you feel that we aren't doing or that we could do better, we, of course, will be very happy to look at those and to implement those if practically possible.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. So now I have Assembly Member Boff wishes to ask some questions.
What is the Mayor currently doing to incentivise the creation of more family-sized homes in London?
So at the moment, the key thing is in the London plan, the policy requiring boroughs to set out the size mix for low-cost rented homes. That is the key thing. And as I said, through our Right to Buyback programme, we are funding larger family-sized homes for Afghan refugees through that, with a higher level of funding. And those homes will, of course, after the Afghan refugee families have moved to permanent accommodation, be available again as temporary accommodation for homes of all Londoners. We're also, of course, lobbying the government for increased funding for our affordable homes programmes, which will then help us to be able to deliver more family-sized homes. We know that family-sized homes are more expensive to deliver than smaller homes. Inevitably, if we can secure more funding for affordable housing, we're able to deliver more family-sized homes. But I would repeat the point that all the homes that we deliver, regardless of the size, help alleviate overcrowding. You know, we've got people, perhaps people who are sharers, currently living in what would be what is a family-sized home, but is currently rented out to a series of sharers. If we build more one-bedroom flats for those people to move into, that then does free up potentially a family-sized home for a family to move into. So it's important, while you're absolutely right, it's important that we deliver more 3-bed plus homes. It's also important that we deliver homes of all sizes across multiple tenures for Londoners to move into.
Would you not agree that the flexibility introduced by building family-sized homes is much greater than building a one-bedroom flat?
I think that that's the case where if you're building a house, I think you're absolutely right. Of course, a lot of the homes that we fund and that are built by the private sector in London are built as flats and sold leasehold, for example. It's much less likely that those homes would then be, I think what you're saying is, if you've got a 3-bed or a 4-bed, it could then be converted into a 2-bed or a couple of 2-beds or a 2-bed and a 1-bed. And that's much less likely where you're building, as we are, mostly in London, because of the nature of our built environment, flats. It's much harder to do that.
When you talked about the London plan, how is that an incentive?
So that then will mean boroughs looking at what is needed locally in their areas, because of course they have to build up the evidence base for their local plans as well. That evidence base will then form the basis of their local plan in terms of what
I understand you're talking about,
and then that informs them when they're taking planning decisions, planning decisions. That will inform whether or not they think that the development that is being proposed is acceptable for their areas. Will help them to push developers to deliver perhaps more family-sized housing.
But that's not a direct incentive for them to build larger family homes.
It gives them an extra sort of stick or lever through the planning.
The question was about what is the mayor currently doing to incentivise the creation of more family-sized homes? Is there extra cash going to them? Are they being directed to increase the number of family-sized homes?
There's extra cash going through the Right to Buyback scheme for family-sized homes for Afghan refugees. As we've discussed before,
we're talking about building new homes in London.
In terms of our affordable homes programme, we fund those based on what our development partners come to us with. And I think if you look at the profile of that, in particular, the funding that goes to councils are more likely to be delivering larger family-sized homes. I walked past 6 very smart-looking family-sized townhouses being built.
I noticed that you regularly tweet pictures of family-sized homes, which are, of course, the minority of what's being built. You said that you just listen to the development partners. So are you just saying that you'll allow whatever the developers come forward with? I mean, if the developers say we much not have...
Bear in mind that when developers are building their schemes, they have to be mindful of the local planning policies and the size mix that is then being set by local councils then has a direct influence on the schemes that these development partners are bringing forward, and therefore on what we are funding them to do. So the Mayor's planning policies will be then driving what developers are offering and what they are doing. But of course, it is for local councils to set the size mix.
But the Mayor is not going to be directing local authorities to build more family-sized homes.
The Mayor doesn't have the power to direct local authorities to deliver homes of a particular size. I don't think that is a power that the Mayor possesses. What the Mayor does through planning policy is to create a particular environment in which local authorities have to operate and in which their plans have to be conformity.
You say the Mayor doesn't have the power to direct, and yet he's directed the boroughs to provide more homes, larger homes for Afghan refugees, which I entirely support.
So that is an offer that the Mayor has made to boroughs to come to us to bid for funding bid for extra funding if they can bring forward larger homes for Afghan.
If the boroughs were to come forward with larger sized homes for extra funding for the rest of the population, the 350,000 kids who are being brought up in overcrowded conditions, the Mayor would be sympathetic to extra funding?
Yeah, so we offer negotiated grant rates already through the 2016 to 23 programme, which means that boroughs can make the case for additional funding for larger homes. But I would just emphasise, as I think I've said to you before, we have a finite pot of money. We have a target that the Mayor wants to hit. Every time we provide additional funding over what would have been the tariff rates, that squeezes that pot of money and therefore makes it more difficult to hit the target. Now, we could have a discussion between the two of us. I mean, you might say, Assembly Member Boff, you would prefer the Mayor to have a sort of a lower target and deliver more family-sized homes. I think that's would be a perfectly reasonable argument for you to set out.
Yes,
but it's more difficult.
We haven't got a lot of your time.
Well, if we have to deliver.
Well, we haven't got a lot of your time. We would like more, but what you're basically saying is that the Mayor will only provide extra money for family-sized homes if he has an infinite pot of money. Is that correct? Or
no, that's a bit hyperbolic.
It's hyperbolic. It's what you said. You said finite resources, and that was that you've only got finite resources, and then that's an excuse not to incentivize family-sized homes. So,
can I just ask guests not to talk over each other because you're on Zoom?
I think there's a slight lag on my collection, so I apologise for that.
Oh, we're both not talking now.
That suits me.
Okay, I'm sorry, Des. I'm going to finish off now, Chair. Sorry, I know this has gone on a little while, but with the resources that the Mayor has available to him, he has still decided not to provide direct financial incentives to ensure that the overcrowding problem can be addressed.
As I say, every single affordable home that is built through the Affordable Homes Programme, either of the affordable homes programmes that we've got, has a direct impact on overcrowding. It absolutely has a direct impact on overcrowding. And, I want to make that point very, very firmly. Every single home that is funded is going to make a positive impact for Londoners, and it's going to have a positive impact on overcrowding, particularly because, as I say, we've got all these concealed households that do benefit where smaller units are developed as well.
Even the penthouses which remain empty that the Mayor is building.
I'm not aware that the Mayor is building any empty penthouses. We're certainly not funding those through the Affordable Homes Programme. We're certainly not funding empty penthouses through the Affordable Homes Programme.
I'll finish there, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, we are super short of time. If we devoted 15 minutes to every one of the remaining questions, Tom would be here for an extra 45 minutes. So let's hurry up.
Excellent.
Assembly Member Moema, you wanted to follow up on that?
Yes, just really briefly, Tom, there are examples of Londoners who stay in overcrowded social housing because they struggle to find a larger unit. And similarly, in the private rented sector, that problem is much more acute. So obviously, it'd be good to hear about what more can be done to provide suitable accommodation. And specifically with regard to the private rented sector, what your views are around rent stabilisation to help people predict the cost of housing and therefore be able to think about moving to larger accommodation.
Yes, thanks very much, Assembly Member Marmot. So yes, we take the private rented sector. One of the key drivers of people being forced into an overcrowded situation is the fact that they can't afford to rent a property that is the right size because of LHA caps, because of the total benefit caps, because of the whole sort of welfare system that people find themselves in at the moment. So that does drive towards overcrowding. So I guess there are two ways of dealing with that. First of all is to increase people's incomes. So get rid of some of these or all of these caps and allow people more income in order that they can rent a property that is of an appropriate size. And the other way to do it, of course, is to make rent more affordable. There's two ways to do that. There is the rent sort of control, stabilization measures, as you say, or of course there is building a lot more properties in order that we can see rents go down. So those are the two main things. Also, of course, we want to be moving families. There are lots and lots of families renting in the private rented sector that 15 years ago would have got a social rented property, and the only reason that they're in the private rented sector is because we don't have enough social rented properties, and that's why it's so important the Mayor is building and funding new social housing through his affordable homes programs. But we know that that the funding that's been provided is insufficient, and we need more funding so that we can do even more.
Thank you, Chair.
I just want to follow up with one quick question about funding, if that's okay. Tom, you mentioned the right to buy back scheme. Now, as far as we know from announcements already made, I think only 45 million has been used for that so far with 2 boroughs. Have you got any updates? And how much is the total pot?
So we launched this, I think, in September, August, September. So it's been going for about 4 or 5 months now. We've confirmed 2 deals with 2 boroughs. Islington for 80 units, including 20 for Afghan refugees. Hounslow for 555 units, including 20 for Afghan refugees and 25 for care leavers. We're in conversation with a number of other boroughs about this as well. So you can expect over the next, few weeks and months, some more announcements coming out. These negotiations range in the size of in terms of the number of units. But boroughs are very, very interested in accessing our funding in order to provide these homes.
And as I understand it, the money's coming from the 2016 to 23 programme for affordable housing grants. What's the total available to the Right to Buy Back Fund?
So there's no sort of set cap. It operates within the constraints of the 2016 to 23 programme. Essentially, there are two routes though. Boroughs that we can use funding from the 16 to 23 programme, or boroughs can also access the ring-fenced right to buy receipts as well. So essentially, there's sort of 2 pots of money through which this can come from. In terms of the 16 to 23 programme, it is limited to the end of that programme because it's not possible for us to do it through the 21 to 26 programme due to the further restrictions placed on how we can use that funding by the government. So I guess my message to boroughs is if you want some funding to do this, get in touch with us quickly.
Okay, that's useful to know. So that's essentially hundreds of millions that we're looking at.
Oh, yeah, I mean, it is, again, it sort of operates within the terms of the 16 to 23 programme. And, to going back, touching on the previous conversation, there is not an infinite pot of money for it, but boroughs who are interested can go look on the website, look at the terms of it, and look at the grant rates which are available.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Lots of boroughs are interested in doing it for temporary accommodation.
You said that.
Yeah.
Already, thanks, Tom. Sorry, just to go back to the numbers and the money, I'm really trying to stick to that. So that seems quite hopeful then. If there are hundreds of millions available and you've managed to do like 600 homes already with about 50 million, that could be quite a significant contribution, and we'll keep monitoring that closely, I think. I just wanted to ask briefly now about the 2012 Games legacy goals, one of which was to ease overcrowding in the boroughs that were called the growth boroughs, the ones that had Olympic venues within them, that had high levels of overcrowding. Now, one of the things that came through in one of the last reports I've seen from the legacy project, where boroughs were getting together and reporting back, was that the overcrowding had not yet been eased, but that was some years ago now, and as mentioned, the data that would show us borough by borough overcrowding rates has disappeared. So are you doing anything to monitor that particular goal of the 2012 Games, and isn't that exactly what the Mayor should be doing, really, those kinds of strategic cross-borough initiatives, particularly related to such a high-profile event?
So first of all, worth noting that these particular conversion goals, which included overcrowding, they were a product of the boroughs. It was a borough. They were borough convergence targets rather than LLDC convergence targets. As far as I'm aware, I think LLDC had its own set of convergence targets, which I don't think included overcrowding. The problem that came very quickly, and this is going back to James Gleason's point about when the data on a borough level stopped being collected, was that the data was no longer available. And I think the next point at which we will have that data at a borough level, which can then be used to look and compare with, what the initial convergence goals were, will be when the census data is published this year. I think that's going to be the point at which a comparison can be made, because pretty quickly after this data, after these convergence targets were established, the department discontinued those particular indicators.
Okay, so that really does, if the census comes out later this year and it's 10 years since the Games, that really does offer us the chance then to assess whether the regeneration benefits that were promised have been delivered, and whether there's more that can be done. I mean, obviously the LLDC area is separately governed and is about delivering homes, and we scrutinise that separately. But to my mind, that area should be providing some of the answers to the problems in the surrounding boroughs. And the question is it doing that?
Yeah, I think it will be interesting, Assembly Member Berry. And in terms of the Olympic legacy, of course, it's worth bearing in mind that there are lots of sort of factors outside of the control of both the LLDC and the boroughs themselves, not least, the national sort of policy and funding environment that they are operating in. But yes, it will be interesting to make that comparison once that data comes out, I think later this year.
Thank you very much. Now, handing over for the final questions to you, to Assembly Member Cooper.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning, Deputy Mayor Copley, or otherwise known as Tom to all of us. So I just wanted to ask you something about downsizing, because I think as well as massive overcrowding in the private rented sector, we also know that there's quite a lot of opportunity for people to downsize if we can do more to persuade people to move into accommodation that's the right size. So what can the role of the Mayor be in creating opportunities for people to downsize from both the private rented sector and also the social housing sector, and also in owner-occupied homes, because there's obviously the same situation really across all tenures? Thanks.
Yeah, it's a very good question, Assembly Member Cooper. So it's quite interesting looking at the sort of the numbers in terms of who occupies family, sort of 3-bed plus family-sized homes. So only 36% of family-sized homes are actually occupied by families with children. The rest are either occupied by single people, couples without children, or of course sharers. About 17% of family-sized homes are occupied by sharers. So that sort of paints a picture. Is actually a minority of family-sized housing in London, 3-bed plus, actually occupied by families with children. I think in terms of addressing under occupation, if you look at the figures, under occupation is much higher, as one might expect, in the owner occupied sector than it is in the social rented sector or the private rented sector. So how do you address that? I think first of all, you have to build homes that people who are currently under occupying, perhaps, a large family-sized home they might have lived in for decades. It might have been their family's home that their children may well have left years ago. You've got to build good, decent, smaller homes that people want to move into. I think that's the crucial thing. I think we know, a lot of older people, for example, when they downsize as well, they don't want to downsize necessarily to a 1-bed. They might want to downsize to a 2-bed, so they've got a spare room for their children, for their family to come and visit. So I think it's absolutely crucial that we are building these smaller units that people actually want to downsize into. We've got programs that the GLA runs on the social rented side, but at a very small scale, it has to be said. So you've got things like the Seaside and Country Homes program, which helps people living in London to downsize, move to the seaside, move to the country. But again, on the social rented side, we have to be building these smaller social rented units that people would want to move into. So someone who has been living in a 3-bed social rented property will say, yes, actually, I would like to downsize to that smaller flat, freeing up a larger family size property for other people. And the benefits of that in terms of the chain are quite remarkable. If someone moves out of a 4-bedroom council flat that they've been under occupying, a family moves in maybe out of a 3-bed, and you get all the benefits all the way down the chain. So it's absolutely right to incentivize that. And of course, some councils do offer financial incentives for people to do this as well, which I think is also very important. But I think the crucial thing is having those homes that people actually want to move into.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, one thing that I did in a previous life when I was working for 1066 Housing Association, no prizes for guessing where 1066 was based, and it then became part of Amicus Horizon, which is now etc. So it's now Optivo, so probably G15, and we did a big downsizing program for people who were in 3- and 4-bedroom houses, and we had a tower block that had been very unpopular because all of the flats were 2-bedroom flats. It had fantastic views of the sea, which of course is helpful, and we persuaded people to move there. We made sure that the lift always worked, really fantastic facilities, communal space, and all the rest of it. So one of the things I wanted to ask you is, do you think the construction of more specialist housing for older Londoners, of the, perhaps asking them to move into, and 2 beds was absolutely crucial to persuading them to move into this very nicely spec'd up block, but it freed up so many 3- and 4-bedroom houses and flats, I can't tell you. So do you think more specialist accommodation would help with this? Because obviously a lot of people who are under occupying tend to also be in the older cohorts.
Yes, absolutely. And I think housing for older people, there's a much sort of broader range now of what older people might be looking for in terms of what their support needs are. And someone who might, an older person who would sort of perhaps, not like the idea of moving into what used to be what would be termed sheltered accommodation, but perhaps would like a specialist older person's accommodation with, good, decent communal areas that's plugged into the community. I remember when I was on the housing committee, going to visit an older person's scheme in Southwark, which was just like this. It was for older people. I think it was I think over 55s, but it was very plugged in into the local community, and it had these sort of community spaces where people from around could come in as well. So it wasn't just some sort of isolated, just people over 55 there. It felt plugged into the local area, which I think is really important. And there's another example as well. I remember my predecessor James Murray, but when he was cabinet member of housing in Islington, took me to see this block of flats that they were building on the edge of one of the council estate. They were mostly 2-bed and a few 1-bed. And the idea was older people living in 3- and 4-bed flats on the estate, downsize into those, freeing those properties up. But it meant people could stay in their community, they could stay on the estate, would not have to move far, but they could free up these properties. And you get all these associated benefits as well. You're paying to heat a smaller flat, so your energy bills go down and things like that. There are lots and lots of benefits.
Yes, and you can have your grandchildren or children to come and stay, or if there's something else happens that's a bit more serious, you can also have a carer who can stay overnight to assist you for a period of time as well. So there's that sort of necessary flexibility. I mean, I'm actually having a discussion with somebody in my constituency now about a scheme that would be very reflective of this, and I'm really hopeful that this will get support from obviously the Deputy Mayor for Planning and the Mayor, but it's the kind of scheme that you would support from your side, from the housing. And yeah, great.
Do send me the details. Yes,
I will do. Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you,
I'll leave it
Assembly
there. I know we're running short of time, so I'll leave it there.
All right, Deputy Mayor Tom, are you leading to go this very second, or would Assembly Member Goff be able to quickly come in?
if it's a very brief one, I'm happy to take it.
Extraordinarily brief. I hope that you could read the GLA Conservatives report Smart Moves, which we published in 2016, which addressed quite this issue of creating homes that are attractive to perhaps elderly people, so that they could downsize. It caused some consternation because we recommended building modern bungalows, but it's I do hope that it's something that you will read in order to inform your policy. Thank you.
I will. Thank you, Assembly Member Boff.
Okay, well, I think we are allowed now to let you go. Tom, thank you very much for coming, and hope whatever you have to do next goes well as well.
Thank you, Chair. I hope the meeting goes well. I'm happy to respond to any letters, of course. Bye, everyone.
Okay, members and guests, I'm now going to take a short 5-minute adjournment for us, and we'll come back in 5 minutes. If the broadcast people want to pause that, yep, they're ready to do that. I'm just going to bang the gavel just to make sure that they know exactly when. But we'll see you all in 5 minutes' time. Thank you. Okay, thank you for that short break, everybody. It is now time to resume the Housing Committee's informal meeting discussing overcrowding in London. So welcome back to all the members and our guests. We've lost Deputy Mayor Tom Copley, but we still have James Gleeson from his team, who's the Research and Analysis Manager. So we can ask about issues relating to that. And I'd like to welcome now Charles True, who's the Head of Policy at Shelter, Beatrice Amir Kingtho-Taylor from London Borough of Harrow, Hakeem Osinaiki, who is from the London Borough of Brent, and Jamie Carswell from the Royal Borough of Greenwich. It's great to have you all here to discuss these issues. There was a lot to think about in that first section. Starting off with questions now, we have Assembly Member Moema.
Great, thank you. So my question is to Beatrice, Jamie and Hakeem. Just as an opener, really, just how do you measure overcrowding at a local authority level? And do you have any data on any changes in demand for family-side properties? So maybe if I start with Beatrice and then Hakeem and then Jamie.
And myself. Thank you, Assembly Member. In terms of what Harrow does, we do have some data at a local level, but the data probably has some limitations as well. So the data that we collect at the moment is around demand is on the housing register. So that's looking at the number of households who are overcrowded and therefore are seeking to move to alternative larger accommodation, for example. So the reason I say that there are some limitations is because also about the policy that we've got in place. So Harrow uses the measure in terms of the priority being given to people that we consider as being severely overcrowded, which means households who are lacking 2 or more bedrooms, and priority is not given to people who are lacking 1 bedroom less, because of the issues that we covered in the earlier session with the lack of affordable accommodation. In terms of the data around severe overcrowding, what we've seen over the last 5 years is that the numbers went down a little bit. Harrow is a small borough, as you know, with very, very small stock, less than 10,000 overall. So in terms of overcrowding, 5 years ago, we probably had about 200 households severely overcrowded in the housing register. That went down to just over 100 pre-pandemic. That's going up slightly again. So we had maintained it at about 100. But we know that if we added in, we also have data around people who are lacking 1 bedroom less, even though they're not giving priority, just so that we can measure what the demand is. If we add those numbers in, every year we get about 300 applications from that group, from households lacking 1 bedroom less. So if we added the two together just to look at the level of overcrowding, where households are actually coming to the council asking for assistance, that would represent about 21% of the housing register. If we exclude those who are lacking 1 bedroom, it reduces to about 5%. So you can see that it's quite a wide gap that we're trying to manage. So that is really the measure that we use. We also have people in temporary accommodation. We've got just over 1,000 people in temporary accommodation. Some of those were in overcrowded households who have since been placed in temporary accommodation, mainly in the private rented sector. So there is a big proportion of households, although currently not considered overcrowded, but were overcrowded and still need affordable accommodation to be moving into. So I would say those are the measures that we use. Obviously, we've got the baseline from 2011 census, which is way out of date. But from the census information, overcrowding in Harrow was about 11%. So again, that kind of gives you the scale of the problem, being a small borough. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Hakeem, if you wouldn't mind.
Yes, thank you, Assembly Member. So very similar in Brent as well. Our measure is mainly about the number of families on the housing register. We're really blind to what's happening in the private rented sector, except through applications to us, either as homeless applications or housing register applications. And we do rarely get housing register applications. So when you think about whether there's been an increase or decrease during the pandemic, the answer is no in Brent, because the number of homelessness applications reduced. But the number of housing register applications, there's no material change there, because when people are desperate for housing, they actually come to the council saying that they are homeless. And if people are assessed as overcrowded, through a homelessness application, our policy is that we find them a private rented accommodation, and we will make sure that that is of a suitable size. So usually, we're able to prevent homelessness before they even get to the stage where they're going into temporary accommodation at all. But when you look at our housing register, it's quite interesting, because very similar to my colleague, we had to make the people who are lacking 2 or more bedroom priority over those who are lacking just 1 bedroom. So the people lacking just 1 bedroom cannot even bid on our bidding system. They are blocked from doing so. We recognize that they have a housing need, but if we were to allow them to bid, it would give a false hope that they might actually get something, because the people who are lacking 2 or more bedrooms have a higher priority than them. So on our housing register, we have about just under 377 households overcrowded by 2 or more bedrooms, and 62 of these are council tenants. And the majority are from Black and Asian ethnicity. I'll stop there. I'll be happy to take any further questions.
Thank you, Hakeem. And then Jamie, please.
Thank you, Assemblymember Moma. You won't be surprised to say, I suppose, that the story is similar in Greenwich, and I'd echo my colleagues' words. The register is key, because that's where we feel, as boroughs, that's where we can make a difference. So that does tend to be the focus. In Greenwich, over the last 5 years, those in severe overcrowding, and I'll echo the points around that's needing 2 bedrooms more. 1 bedroom doesn't get you into that category, has doubled from 360 up to 590 over the last 5 years on that housing register in that category. So it's a mounting pressure. The other source of data that is just worth the committee being aware of is that councils will, from time to time, planning, either through the planning department or through the housing department, conduct strategic housing market needs assessments, and that is best practice for updating local plans, but also obviously informing housing strategies. Now, those are big, clunky pieces of work that cost a lot of money to conduct, because effectively you're doing primary research in the borough with households across the private and public rented sector and owner occupiers. That's something that the committee may want to weigh up, but resources are tighter and tighter for doing this type of what can be quite strategic needs analysis work in our communities.
Okay, so that's really interesting that your numbers have been fairly steady, but that's obviously looking at people who are severely overcrowded rather than the wider picture. So with that in mind, the statutory definition of overcrowding hasn't changed since it was introduced in 1935. So I would imagine the answer would be yes, but do you think the statutory definition should be changed? And if so, how should it be changed? So perhaps we'll start with Hakeem this time, if that's okay.
Thank you, Assemblymember Moma. I don't think the problem is the definition. It's a technical definition. But the people who are overcrowded, who are looking for assistance from the council, don't understand that statutory definition, and therefore, when they are being assessed against it sounds like a blocker. It sounds like we don't want to help them, rather than it being the issue. So our cabinet just agreed our new allocation scheme yesterday, where we actually removed, assessment based on the statutory definition of overcrowding, particularly for council tenants. To say if you are lacking this number of bedrooms, then you'll be in this band, and if you're lacking that number of bedrooms, you'll be in that band, and that makes it easy and straightforward for people to understand.
Okay, so are you suggesting that it's more of a technical tool and therefore the application is more important? So how have you applied it? What kind of changes would make it more useful, or have you made it more useful to yourself?
I think, yes, what I'm saying is, there's nothing wrong with the technical definition itself. I think it's the application. And I think what local authorities should try and do is to simplify, translate the technicality into a simple language that both officers and residents will understand, and fit it into, whether it's the assessment of homelessness or our allocation scheme.
Thank you. And if I could take Beatrice, Jamie, and then Charlie, I think you wanted to come in.
Well, what I would add probably to what Hakeem has said is I think that's quite helpful. I think it's a technical definition. However, I think it separates the level of overcrowding. It just gives a higher indicator in that the response enables us to respond a lot more quicker in terms of the limited resources to those who are statutorily overcrowded, because if they are, they shouldn't really be left a day longer in the situation that they're in, bearing in mind we're juggling limited resources amongst everybody. So it does, it does create more of an agency to help those people, albeit what the solution normally is placing people in private rented sector, which is really not the best option. It may be an option temporarily while we find alternative longer term accommodation for the household. So yes, it's a technical definition, but I think it kind of helps the response.
Okay. And then just a cheeky question really quickly. Hakeem, you said that you felt that you're a little bit data blind when it came to the PRS. So how does that interplay happen if you place somebody using this?
Sorry, I didn't get that last bit.
In your previous, in the previous question, you said you're a little bit data blind to what's happening in the PRS, sorry. And so with bearing in mind what Beatrice has said, that an option is to place somebody in appropriately sized accommodation in the PRS, what kind of ongoing assessment might there be to make sure that it continues to be the right size? Okay, so when we get an approach for assistance from a household, we have a statutory obligation and a moral one, of course, to make sure that the accommodation we find for the family is suitable for them, not only in size, but also affordability, suitable in every sense. And therefore, when we place them there, we negotiate with the landlord to keep them for at least 2 years. And then we have officers who support them, to settle them in that accommodation. And we find in our borough that actually, the majority of these people never come back to us as homeless. They strike a good relationship with their landlords, and then they live there for many years because of I think the initial proper settlement. When I say blind to data, as Jamie said, what we rely on is demand. Is people coming to us for assistance. So the blindness I meant is if people don't come to us, they may still be overcrowded, but we don't know. Another way, something else that is happening in Brent, which is just related, is that we're seeing a lot of conversion of family homes to HMOs. Because we register HMOs, we're seeing an increase in the registration of HMOs. And usually that would be a family size accommodation that would have been let as a family size accommodation in the private rented sector. Okay, thank you. Take Jamie and then Charlie, please.
Yeah, so I think, sorry, I thought you were bringing in Charles as well. You put his hand up halfway through, but he's taken it down again. Would you like to contribute, Charles? It'd be great to hear from you because we haven't heard from you yet in this meeting.
Yeah, I can come in after Jamie if that's possible, but on the same question would be great. So. Okay,
great. Sorry.
I'm not sure I've much to add what colleagues have said from a local authority perspective. No, so I'll keep things moving.
Okay. Over to you, Charlie.
So I think, like, to answer your question simply, is the standard good enough? Well, I wouldn't say so. I think the challenge is that it has been updated for many, many years. But the fact is that just changing the standard doesn't change the reality on the ground for the councils, as the councillors have said, and as the representatives of the councils have said. Because the challenge is that when you're in a situation whereby you've got so little available housing to put people in, that you're having to choose between which desperate people to help, then fundamentally changing the standards doesn't help that final situation. So fundamentally for us, it is really about making sure that the understanding the data and understanding the rates of overcrowding should be used to push for that extra building of genuinely good quality and genuinely affordable social housing, because that's where the real gap is, and that's where we've seen a huge number of losses and net loss of social housing over the last 20 years, basically. So what I'd say is, councils will do what they can and they will try, but they're stuck between a rock and a hard place on that. And if we play with the standards, all we will do is showcase just how bad the situation is. There are 1.1 million households on the social housing waiting list in England, and that isn't probably a real true reflection of the number. It's probably far larger. This is a very big housing emergency. Is a very big challenge that we need to kind of be addressing at a proper scale. Yeah, while I agree with you that it needs to change, the reality is that we have to get building. The second thing I'd say as well is in terms of data, just very simply, obviously the English Housing Survey, which we are reliant on as a kind of national charity to find out that information, doesn't use the same measure as the official standard. So the actual data isn't reflective of the real scale of the challenge, but it's the best estimate that you can get. To be fair to them, any kind of analysis of overcrowding will be an estimate unless you are literally going into people's homes and saying how many people are there in every single house. So it will always be an estimate, but either way, the numbers are already really high enough for us to say that there needs to be action taken in both the private rented sector and the social rented sector.
So if the change is not necessarily about the technical aspects of this, what would be, from your perspective, from Sheffield perspective, be the starting point to address overcrowding?
I mean, in terms of solutions, well, frankly, as I've said already, build social housing. So at the heart of London's overcrowding crisis is that simple reality that they were not building enough truly affordable social homes that Londoners need. Social housing is the only form of affordable, like we think is the only form of genuinely affordable housing, simply because it's tied to local incomes rather than arbitrary market rates. So the GLA has done some good work at the moment with allocating money from the AHP, the Affordable Homes Programme, and prioritising homes for social rent. So I think the majority of the affordable homes built over the next period will be for social rent. But obviously, part of the big challenge here is that we've seen quite a lot of net loss through demolitions and sales. So in London, from 20, for the last, I think it's 5 years I've got here, for London social rent built was about 4,000. Right to buy sales were about minus 12,000. So you get a net loss essentially in terms of built of about minus 7,600 homes. That's a bit of that's a terrible situation to be in, and it reflects the national situation whereby we're losing about 22,000 homes across England. So very clearly, the disappearance of social homes means that there's not really enough truly affordable homes available for those on low income, which means that they are forced to compromise and they're forced to choose between an affordable home or a quality home. And by quality, I mean whether it's got overcrowding or damp or mold problems, etc. So that's one really clear thing that you can do. Secondly, a specific thing, but generally about welfare, is improving the administration of discretionary housing payments. So these are specific one-off kind of payments, well, not necessarily one-off, but specific payments that can go to individuals to help mitigate some of the kind of social security cuts, etc. And they can help families access adequately sized properties. But the challenge is in the name of discretionary housing payments, in that they're discretionary. So getting the help that you need can end up being a bit of a postcode lottery between different councils. And there's really different challenges in the decision-making process. But essentially, a lot of the time, your chances of success may be when you when you apply within a year, and how much money the council has left within that DHP pot. The second problem with those is they're not very widely advertised, so I think it's very important to make sure that people know that these are available, so that they can start moving, and they can start making advantage of this. But obviously, the very big thing, of course, is then lobbying national government for that fairer social security system, because the rates of local housing allowance being frozen is generally fueling overcrowding and forcing families choosing between an overcrowded home or falling into debt. So unfreezing the local housing allowance at a national level and relinking rates with market rents would be very significant. Those are big things to do, but I think this reflects the scale of the problem and something that we need to kind of join together to try and make happen.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Assemblymember Buff, you wanted to just add something in this section?
Yes, I'd like to ask our guests whether or not they have compiled data on whether or not the provision of one-bedroom flats rather those have been taken up by people in overcrowded conditions, whether or not you have data on that. The Deputy Mayor has contended that the provision of these one-bedroom flats can contribute to the problem, contribute to resolving overcrowding, but we don't appear to have much data on that. So it'd be useful if any of the boroughs represented had compiled that data for themselves.
I agree that the principle is right. That by building not just any old one-bedroom property, by the way, but by understanding the type of accommodation or properties that people who are under occupying need, and building to that need would certainly address overcrowding. I have no doubt about that. I could read off to you stats about under occupation, which are quite frightening. I have three single households currently occupying, 3 6-bedroom houses in Brent, and it goes on. Over 400 single-person households occupying, 400 3-bedroom properties, and it goes on and on. So at the moment, we are talking to all of those people, understanding exactly the type of accommodation they would want to move to. And we're putting that as part of our new build scheme and talking to RPs, because we're creating a nurturing relationship with RPs so that they don't just build what they want, and count the numbers, that they're building what we need in our borough, because we have an understanding of exactly what that demand is. And it costs a lot of money to build a 4, 5, 6-bedroom house, but it's a lot cheaper to convince someone to move to a desirable smaller property. So we're at an early stage. I know what the demand is in terms of under occupation, and I know that we've moved 12 families this year. But what I cannot give you is to say if we build X number of one beds, then Y number of people will certainly move. I mean, that helps.
I understand the theory, and without doubt, some people's overcrowding will be resolved by moving into one-bedroom accommodation. It will alleviate some pressure on an existing household. I just want to see if that's happening. I mean, that's the theory, and the data that's happening. I mean, yeah. Is it a regularly compiled data on that basis?
If I can jump in, Assemblymember, I'm very taken with the story that Assemblymember Cooper told earlier on of the desirable tower block and the 2-bedroom flats, and it is something the Deputy Mayor told us that they are spending money on buying effectively on the market, although they're right to buy back homes. Family homes to directly provide, and it is possible there is more efficiency in buying desirable 2-bed homes, but we don't know. And I'd be really interested to find out if any boroughs have an initiative like that, where they can give us a similar story to what Assemblymember Cooper was telling us about from her previous work. And presumably that was some time ago. You've been an Assemblymember for some time now.
Well, I've been an Assembly member since 2016, and I was working in Hastings before that. Yeah, so obviously I can work out the precise timing of that, but it worked out incredibly well because the vacancy level was unbelievably low once people had moved in, and once it had kind of got onto the gossip grapevine that this was a really fantastic, we had a waiting list of people saying they wanted to move into the block who wanted to downsize, and because it was only targeted at those people, that made up the entire waiting list, was people downsizing to 2 beds, and it was really worked well. You had to make sure the lift was always in working condition.
I want to hear about this from London boroughs though, because obviously you had a nice view of the sea to offer people and all. No, here we are. Jamie has put his hand up. Sorry, is that all right, Assemblymember Buff? If I just hand back the question to you, but bring in the other guests.
Look, I'm well familiar with the theories, and that downsizing will create, but just removing downsizing. Please do contradict me, but just removing solving downsizing will not solve the problems of overcrowding.
No, we're not saying it's instead of anything else.
Over the years, and it's been put up as a solution to overcrowding. It isn't. It's just part of the issue.
Yeah, part of the solution. I'm not saying it's the entire solution at all.
But I would want to hear from the boroughs whether or not they've done that analysis.
So yes, we have 2 boroughs who've put their hands up now. We've started to talk about this. So should we move on to them and hear more? Is that all right?
Thank you very much.
Looking at my screen, I can't see who put their hand up first from the viewer have, but I think possibly.
I think it was Jamie, Chair.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it, Jamie. Thank you.
Three quick points, Chair. First of all boroughs will monitor the number of lettings they make to under occupiers, because it'll be defined, in their scheme and in their own policy. So that will be monitored. For example, in Greenwich, we did about, from memory, about last year was anomalous. It was about 20 last year. The year before that, 40 to 50. So it's a significant number. Not all boroughs have an additional bedroom policy. Sometimes they choose to do that, and they're really focused on that incentive. Other times, other boroughs look at different types of incentives, either financial incentives, help with moving, or indeed just the quality of the home, and they prioritise some of the new homes for downsizing. It's obviously just one one arrow in the quiver. It's not the complete solution. If we were having a discussion, for example, about single vulnerable homeless people, well, I think we'd be having a conversation about, why we do need some 1 beds for single vulnerable homeless people and rough sleepers, say, but that's not what we're talking about today. So we always need to get the balance. I think I reflect on, for example, the council building programme in Greenwich, where we've got to 70%. 70% of that program, the 760 odd homes that will be started, in this 4-year slot are family homes, and 42% of them are 3-bed or more. So it is possible for councils to use some of the tools under the other tools in their armour, if you like, as well as under occupation schemes.
Excellent. And now we have Hakeem as well. You have your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. Assemblymember Buff, I agree with you that under occupation is only one of the tools, but I would say it's actually a major tool, if not the main one. So in my borough, for example, the number of households who are currently overcrowded by 2 or more bedrooms is under 1,200. Meanwhile, the number of people under occupying their homes in our council stock, not even RPs in the borough, is just under 1,400. Now, I'm not saying it's a perfect fit, but that shows you that actually, if we concentrated a lot of our efforts, money, time, into moving those 1,400 households into the right type of accommodation, we will free up a huge number of properties that would then solve the problem of the families who are overcrowded. So I think we should do that, and we are doing it. But we are also building new homes. The mayor was, the deputy mayor, Tom Copley, was asked a question earlier about whether or not the GLA was specially incentivizing boroughs, to build larger family homes. And I think it would work if the GLA did that. But even though they don't advertise that, they actually do, because our bid in the 21-26 grant round is mainly large family homes, which meant we needed a larger portion of grant to make it work, because as you all know, they're expensive to build. Yeah. And the GLA agreed with everything we said, with our arguments on that, and they are funding that scheme. So we are building large family homes, but I believe that a lot of energy should be concentrated on the occupation, not just because we need the accommodation people are living in, but there's also the issue of fuel poverty, and looking after those. In a lot of cases, the people living there, one-bedroom households, elderly people who are unable to look after such a large property. So actually, we're doing our social responsibility to make sure that they are living in a home that they can maintain and feel comfortable in, and at the same time, killing the other bird with the same stone of then making sure that, families that are overcrowded have access to that type of accommodation as well.
Thank you very much, Hakeem. I'm just fishing out the numbers. You mentioned the higher housing grants you'd got from the 2021 to 26 programme. We've looked at that, and for boroughs that are only getting grant for social housing, we're actually able to work out the average grant per home, and for you it's £159,000 per home. So that is significantly higher than the previous grants that were available, and I think that is reflected. There are some flexibilities now that there didn't used to be to claim higher grant. Not that 159,000 gets you an awful lot, but then that is at least higher than 100, which it was before.
All right.
So Charles, you've got your hand up. I can't keep forgetting to call you Charlie. Sorry, Charlie from Shelter. You want to come in on this?
So I think I was just going to say a more general point, which is that though specific boroughs will have specific challenges that they can address. What I think the challenge with the downsizing argument tends to be that people look at the overall number of number of underoccupied homes, and then they look at the number of people who are in overcrowded homes and then say, well, why can't we fix one with the other? And the challenge with that is the tenure that they're in. So a lot of the people who are in underoccupied homes are in owner-occupied, they own their home, and a lot of those own their own home outright. What you're not going to be able to do is build a home that those people want to move into and then take that home and put an overcrowded family into it. It will have to trickle through the system, which takes quite a while until it gets down to the person who's actually in need. So yes, it's part of the mix, and yes, it's an important part of your planning, etc. But I think what needs to be concentrated on, or what the GLA and what councils need to concentrate on, is looking at how to build the right types of homes for the needs for the people who are on low incomes, who are in need. So building those homes for them, rather than kind of thinking about a long market structure trickle down, because I mean, obviously with the affordable homes program, you're building homes for the people who are in need, and that's right. But it's relying on kind of making sure that our theories are correct and precise, rather than kind of relying on a kind of oversimplified idea that one can fix the other.
Thank you very much for that, Charles. That's right. We've got in our briefing and in analysis that goes with the strategic housing market assessment, I think, for London, you can see there that the numbers of people who are in local authority rented accommodation who are under-occupying does not match the numbers in overcrowded homes. The majority, the highest levels of under-occupation are in the owner-occupier sector. So there needs to be something that at least, if we're going to do the numbers game, we need to pull those out as well. Now, Tony Devenish, Assemblymember Devenish, you have your hand up to contribute as well, and then we'll move on to the next section because we haven't got all.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be very brief, and actually the guests could write to us rather than answer this now, and that will be fine by me. My question is, Deputy Mayor said when he was here that there was nothing else that he could do to solve overcrowding with his existing powers and existing budgets. It was all, as usual, the government's fault. Is there anything that you, as expert panelists, think that the mayor, with their existing powers and existing budgets, can do to overcome overcrowding? And as I'm saying, I'm happy to have written answers, Chair, rather than take up time now.
I think, yeah, we also have some further questions later on. So if people can mull, and maybe when we get back to those further questions at the end, let's get some things we can do with our powers in London. I agree that we should be absolutely seeking that, and not just taking it's the government line every single time. Right, I want to move on now to some more questions about the actual impacts of overcrowding, because we've spent a lot of time discussing numbers so far today, but I think the reality for people on the ground needs a bit of attention, and the consequences of living in overcrowded homes. So I want to start with Charlie, if that's all right, from Shelter, and get a bit more of an idea of what, I mean, the bedroom standard is currently used to discuss at the borough level whether people are short of 1 bedroom or 2 bedrooms versus what they are entitled to or what they should have. In reality, I mean, we're looking at this, the definitions here. It does mean that if you've got 1 bedroom, and in practice that's often 1 room, that's a studio flat, you can live there with a parent and 2 children up to the age of 10, or 2 parents and 1 child up to the age of 10. That's not even an overcrowded home. And living in a home with 1 bedroom less than your needs, you add another child to each of those calculations. Now that's very, very overcrowded in my view. That makes life, many aspects of life, impossible. If you can all sleep, you can all find a room place to lie down, but what else are the consequences of living in that close proximity in a small space altogether like that? If you can give us any evidence you have, or any other places we could go and ask for written evidence, that would be really useful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're completely right that so that this has a major impact on people's lives, their health and their well-being, and I think overcrowding, especially with the pandemic, has caused some really serious problems. So living in those cramped and overcrowded homes can put that strain on your physical and mental health of your family. And if you are overcrowded, you're more likely to also have bad conditions, which compounds the problem. Because you're making that choice between affordable and quality, what you're tending to do is ending up in the worst end of the private rented sector. And also because of the lack of social house building, as if you're in the social housing sector, then a lot of that stock is getting older and is kind of having problems with it. So it's true of London households where about 40% of overcrowded households report significant mold, compared with only about 16% when a household isn't overcrowded. Mold obviously increases the risk of respiratory infections, and in fact, living with many other people in overcrowded conditions can also spread the risk of some respiratory and other infectious diseases. Children living in those overcrowded homes are much more likely to contract those infectious diseases. For example, they're up to 10 times more likely to contract meningitis. On top of that, there is a huge stress to living in a home that's too small, and it's taking a massive toll on people's mental health. So parents often call us up and tell us about the living nightmare of feeling trapped in the housing that's not big enough for the children. And obviously it can mean not having anywhere for the kids. It can be not having anywhere to do their homework, not having enough space to play, not having enough space to crawl even in some circumstances, especially in that overcrowded temporary accommodation. So it can impact your toddler, it can impact the development of toddlers who don't have that space. It can impact the life chances of the kids because they can't have enough space to concentrate. But also for the parents, it takes a huge mental strain for those people who are fighting to keep their home and fighting to try and give their kids a good life, but knowing that they can't give them privacy, they can't get privacy themselves, knowing that having a kid in their bed means that they will get disturbed sleep, and knowing that that will just cause, lack of sleep, lack of space will result in arguments and challenge and strain on those family relationships. It can mean sleeping on the floor or the sofa. It can mean having literally no place to put your storage or anything that you need for your life. No escape from any noise and no room to be alone. So we've got a couple of stories from people in London For example, Alice, who's from London, who lived in a 1-bedroom flat with 4 children, who described how she just has 2 small square surfaces. She can't put her plates on the surface to dish out the food. She's got a lot of depression. She can't remember the last time she even had any friends over because she's so embarrassed about the state of her own place, and having absolutely no social life, and having to always just meet people outside because you can't wash properly and you can't wash your home up properly. So it really gives that horrible sense of, she says, and this is a quote from her, she's unhappy and feeling like I failed my kids, not giving them a proper home and stability. I have to put a mattress in the living room every night on the floor. Every night on the floor to sleep with my newborns, having to sleep on the floor in their own Moses basket in the very little gap provided. That kind of situation with somebody whose baby's on a basket on the floor and they're sleeping on a mattress in the living room, that's just unsustainable, and it's really terrible conditions that will create those problems. Again, a lot of people who are in these overcrowded situations are on low incomes. They might also be on housing benefit because they have or are living with someone who has a disability. And that can cause major problems. Obviously, lack of space for people with a form of disability often means that they don't have anywhere to put their any kind of equipment or wheelchairs, etc. And that can just basically cause major problems for them when they're trying to manage their condition. And equally, because a lot of the time when they complain, there is nothing that they can do because there is nowhere for the council to put them. So there's a story from Venus in London, who lives in a 2-bed flat with a partner and 3 children, saying that that she has a child with a disability, goes to special school and a social worker, but even though the social worker has kind of complained to their council, nothing was done for 5 years. And she's just wondering if they're going to have to spend the rest of their life essentially sharing the same bed until with their husband and their children. So this is just kind of the situation that they are having to live in. Obviously, the pandemic, as we've seen, has exacerbated that to some degree, but also it has exacerbated the experience of that. So one of the key challenges, of course, is that people lost income and work and have to turn to housing benefit to try and survive, which means they've been put in harder conditions. But it also means that a lot of people were asked to kind of leave by family or friends as a major cause of homelessness. And overcrowding can often be linked to those types of cases. So sometimes it can actually drive up rates of homelessness as well. And we're having a growing, during the pandemic, we saw a growing number of people being asked to leave their homes by friends and family members and landlords, especially because they were scared about the spread of COVID-19. So there's that kind of sofa surfing homelessness that's also contributing to some of these situations, but it's also bringing meaning that those people might actually end up in worse forms of homelessness. So I suppose, to summarize, it has a really horrible impact on people's lives, and it doesn't affect us all equally, though. So I think it's already been said, it's households on low incomes, it's single parents and minority ethnic groups and younger people who are most affected by housing overcrowding. And particular groups within that are more likely to live in overcrowded homes. So it's already been said, but Bangladeshi, Pakistani and Black African households are more likely to live in overcrowded homes. I think this therefore just shows that this is something that really needs to go. And particularly, there was a Public Health England review, I think, that's worth looking about the disparities of COVID-19 outcomes, because that particularly showed that people from Black, Asian or minority ethnic backgrounds are more likely to be at risk of COVID-19 infection because they were more likely to live in overcrowded households in urban areas, in deprived areas, and have jobs that expose them to those at a higher risk. So overcrowding plays a part of that wider disparity of how the pandemic has hit and affected us all. So to summarize, I suppose it's a really horrifying experience for those people, and it needs to be properly addressed. And I think the solution to that, I think we've said, is to build enough social homes, and particularly social homes. It's to sort out the DHPs. You asked what London can do. Particularly, it's about providing that guidance on local housing allowance, so that you the discretionary housing payments, so that there isn't this kind of sense that it is essentially random between each borough. and work on some kind of awareness raising about those DHPs so that people know how to apply for those grants. That will in the short term contribute one thing, but equally I think it's about lobbying the national government for a fairer social security system and more grant for social housing. I'll leave it there. I'll let others go on, but I hope that's kind of showed some of the impact that affects on people.
That's incredibly useful. And yes, we're seeking to look at what research there has been on these issues as well. And thank you for sharing those examples. I can see that we have Hakeem with his hand up. I did want to put a question to you. So can I do that? And can you also make your contribution at the same time? Because we heard that example there of the mother with 4 children living in a one-bedroom flat. Now, that's clearly a severe overcrowding case. When someone comes to you, and this is a question to all the boroughs as well, when someone comes to you with a case like that, for how long do they normally have to wait before you're able to give them a larger home? If they're already in social housing and in that overcrowded state, how long before they get to move? And do you get people approaching you who are in the private rented sector in those kinds of situations? And is the help you give different?
Were you going to me first? Was that?
That is to Hakeem, who had his hand up, from Brent, and then to all the boroughs actually as well. This is about what practical help boroughs are giving to people in that situation.
Thank you, Chair. The reason I had my hand up was just to add something to what Charlie had said, which is education attainment. It's a big issue affected by overcrowding. If young people don't have a space to study, we all know the impact of that. I mean, just very briefly, there's a story of a family that we housed in one of our new builds, and a young lad of about 9 years old pushed this stuff in a supermarket cart to the place. And when the family realized it wasn't, there's no furniture on that day, they said, oh, they're moving next week. And he said, no, I'm not leaving. I am sleeping in my room tonight. I don't care, whether it's furnished or not. So, it's a huge emotional thing that, for the first time in his life, he's going to have his own room where he can study. In terms of the question that you asked, we all know about the housing crisis, and therefore, there's a really long wait for people, waiting for particularly large-size accommodation. However, if it depends on the situation, the situation determines how we assist them. So for people who are in the private rented sector, who are overcrowded, but at the level that you described, if they approached us, then we will find them a suitable private rented accommodation as an alternative, even before they have to leave there. If they approach us early, even before they have to leave the one they're living in, if they approach us late, we'll put them in temporary accommodation and find them a suitable, the right size accommodation for their family to live in. For council tenants or housing association tenants, or for people for whom we're unable to find in a private rented sector, then the wait is significant. So for the wait for a 4-bed in Brent is 17 years. If you join the housing register today waiting for a 4-bed, basically there's an average of 17 years wait. And it gets worse if it's
and that's even with priority given because of severe overcrowding.
Correct. So this is why we say to residents, as much as they don't like it, that asking for a council property is never a quick solution to an immediate overcrowding or homelessness problem, and that is why we focus our attention on making sure that the private rented sector in Brent is well run, well managed, and there's quality, good quality accommodation available there, because that is in the main the most reliable and quick solutions to families. Just
to clarify a little tiny bit before I move on, I'll move on to Beatrice next, if that's okay. If somebody's already got a council tenancy and they're now overcrowded in that council tenancy, you will never persuade them to give that up for private rented sector, surely?
We try, but we don't. It's a struggle to say to someone to live a secure tenure for an insecure tenure. But we have in Brent we have I4B, which is a wholly owned council private landlord, and even though it's not a secure tenancy, we let people know that it is owned by the council and it is managed by the council, and therefore, in the same way as you would not be evicted from your normal council tenancy, you would not be evicted from this one. But to get a council accommodation, social housing, then you've got to queue up. It's inevitable. You've got to queue up, and people wait for well over 20 years to get rehoused in a council property.
Okay, thank you. We can all see the problem there is there, clearly there. Beatrice, is there anything you do differently? I can see that it's very, very acute there in Brent, in Harrow. I was wondering about rental rates as well. I know Hakeem just said that in the PRS people are placed into the right size homes. Now that must be quite expensive. Does it vary by borough? And do you manage to do that as well within benefit rates that apply at the moment?
I think it varies slightly, but I wouldn't probably say it varies that much. I think placements in the private rented sector, I'll probably say across London have similar issues. We talked earlier about the welfare reforms with the local housing allowance rates. They never match what the landlords will always ask for. So there'll always be a gap that the tenants of the household will be expected to pay. And so there's always issue of affordability or whether or not they can actually afford to do that. As councils, we try our best to negotiate deals with landlords when we're acquiring properties so that they are either at local housing allowance rate, or if they're not, the gap between the rent that they're going to charge is as minimal as possible. We have varying successes in doing that, but the numbers of properties that we can acquire through that route obviously isn't sufficient to meet the demand that's available. So again, it's another option we explore where we think we can actually help those who can go into that sector and minimize the level of the gap that they have to actually pay from the benefits that they receive. So there is that option. But also just going back to the point you raised about overcrowding the private rented sector. So from Housing Register, for example, we actually have the majority of those who are on the Housing Register severely overcrowded, who are waiting for council property, and it is a long wait. It's higher, so 80% of those on the Housing Register are actually applications from the private rented sector, and 20% are from our own social housing tenants, so housing association or council tenants. But it is a long wait. So on average, if somebody's waiting in Harrow for a 3-bedroom property, depending on their choices, again, we do say there is choice, even though it's limited, and that's why it's about bidding for where a household feels they have to live. They can wait between 3 to 6 years if they're willing to take a property, for example, on an estate, which is what we tend to get. Might be a flat on an estate. They may wait maybe 3 to 4 years. If they're waiting for a house, it could go up to 10 years. So, the choice determines how long a household can wait as well. If somebody needs a 4+ bedroom, again, it can vary from 5 to 10 years, depending on what choices they're willing to compromise on. So we talk to households about options in private rented sector, but if somebody already has a social tenancy, it's very difficult, I think, for them to choose to go into private rented sector because of the loss of security of tenure, and I think that's understandable. But at the same time, we find the households who are overcrowded in private rented sector accommodation because of the security of tenure, and they tend to maybe move every year or every 2 years, feel that they'd rather wait in the private rented sector where they're accommodated and wait for an affordable social housing tenancy when and if that becomes available. So the waiting time does go up and up. That's kind of how we deal with it. We talk through the options with the individual, and then it's a decision that they can make about what options they feel we should work with them or pursue for them, depending on the circumstances that they're in. But yeah, they're not quick, easy solutions.
Okay, that's really illuminating. Thank you so much. I think it's clear people are out there being forced to choose between different bad options, essentially, and waiting for the right thing for such a long time. It does seem to me that improvements of conditions in the private rented sector, especially to do with security, might make a difference to some people's choices, and that is a thought to take away, I think. Jamie from Greenwich, did you have anything to add on those points?
Some very quick points, Chair. I suppose just to go back to Charlie's case study, I mean, it is invidious that the choices that people are in, and you know that I pulled out the headline statistics of the last year in Greenwich. So we've just under 600 severely overcrowded on the register, and we made 92 lettings. So just in that category alone, assuming no one else is coming in that's more severely overcrowded or has further priorities, that's 6 years worth of severely overcrowded. A very crude, basic, high-level stat, and so the story that Charlie repeated does not surprise me, and my heart goes out to that mother and indeed the thousands of other families across London that are in this situation. You challenged us with our two sort of quick, interesting, possible. It's not a solution, but interventions that might be in the right direction of travel. The first thing is, and it touches on some of the earlier contributions, we don't measure our social rented programs of what's being delivered either in councils or the GLA necessarily by the number of large bedroomed homes. We talk about the number of homes being built, and targets matter around this. And obviously, from what we've heard, there is flexibility around the GLA grant rates, and there is a lot of focus on that. But I think sometimes just being able to report that and talk about a target may make a difference. And my second point is just around what's happening in the private rented sector around benefits. And Charlie alluded to this in his earlier evidence. LHA was frozen, as I'm sure the committee is aware, for many years until 2020, when it was unfrozen at the beginning of the pandemic. What wasn't uplifted at the same level was the benefit cap. So the LHA has gone up, but the benefit cap has not gone up by the same percentage. It's remained fixed. That means proportionally far more families in the private, particularly, families with, most likely to be overcrowded with large numbers of children, are being caught by a benefit cap. That is a direct influence in terms of overcrowding the private rented sector, and cannot be understated in terms of our interventions and then what we see through homelessness and councils.
Thank you. That's really helpful too. And then I think I should probably move on from this section. But what I'm interested, if you can write to us if you've got any initiatives like this, if you've done any work to look at the impact on particular groups within your boroughs. We know that people in different minority groups are not evenly distributed around London. If there are any particular initiatives you've done within your boroughs to either measure or take action to improve particularly overcrowding in those groups, we'd really like to hear about that. Obviously, it's probably too complicated or interesting to tell us in this meeting in detail. So yeah, we'd love to hear more. I need to pass on now to more questions about the actions we might take, and Assemblymember Moema is going to lead on this.
I am, thank you. I think you might have covered some of this already, but just Charles and everybody else, what's the relative role of housing costs in driving overcrowding versus the availability of larger homes is the first bit, and then how have changes to benefits and support for low-income families affected this?
Should I go first then? Best jump in. I mean, I think I've alluded to this in many different ways. I think affordability is a really key thing, particularly in London, where it has driven a lot of the challenges that people face. As I said, they're having to make that choice between affordable and quality. In fact, it is a problem in many other parts of the country too. But seeing as we're here to talk about London, I'll focus on that. So one of the key things that we looked at is actually the number of people that have ended up on turning to housing benefit to pay. to pay for their rent, and that is a really key thing. So this is talking a lot, both private renters and social renters. So many people obviously did lose that income, but the number of private rent during the pandemic in particular, but the number of private renting households in London claiming housing support to pay their rent rose by 66% between February 2020 and May 2021. So in some boroughs, a majority of private renters now rely on housing support, which includes, so Enfield, about 75% of private renters, we estimate, receive housing support. In Barking and Dagenham, 62%, and Brent, 56%. So what you're actually seeing there is a large number of people, but essentially it's the state sponsoring high private rents in many different ways, because that's the only way that you can get people into those homes. So absolutely, the affordability challenge is a major problem. In terms of suitability of size of the homes, I think we've all said that it's part of the mix, but you need to be looking at the right types of tenure and the right places as well in order to do that. So the ways of fixing that, I think, are critical. So we've talked a bit about building social homes, and I'm pleased to say the GLA has focused more on ending up social homes rather than focusing on kind of home ownership products that aren't really affordable for most people, or focusing.
Charles, we're breaking up on this one, sorry.
Everyone's getting the same breakup there from Charles, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe he could turn off his camera, or he has.
I think it did it. I think we might have lost him completely for the moment.
I've tried turning off my camera.
Ah, there we go.
Yeah, that's better.
Can you see me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, that's better.
Hear you.
I'm afraid I just got a message saying it was unstable, so I don't know whether you heard any of that. But
It'd be great.
At what point did I go off? Because I've been talking for a little bit. I think I was saying, I said the point about the number of people who are claiming housing benefit has significantly gone up, and I think a number of people, obviously in London in particular, and have ended up in these situations during the pandemic, particularly. However, I think policies such as welfare policies has obviously been a really key factor in that. In terms of the local housing allowance, yes, it was raised to the 30th percentile in 2020 after quite a lot of work from Shelter and other organisations to campaign for that. But there are challenges in that still only covers the bottom 30% of rents, or rather, but bottom 30% of homes in an area, and also things like the benefit cap end up particularly affecting certain groups as well, such as single mothers being forced to choose between paying their rent and feeding their families, essentially. So affordability is a really critical part of this. It's the particular issue in those areas, and it forces people to overcrowd and to choose poor quality homes, or if that is a choice at all, because it really isn't. Solutions is going to be the building of the social homes, and it's particularly looking at trying to kind of fix those welfare challenges that I've said before. I will stop talking because I think my internet's not great.
Thank you. I don't know if Beatrice, Hakeem, or Jamie, if you wanted to add anything.
Yes, if I could, Assembly Member Moima. So I agree with everything that Charlie said, because it applies across all of London, and I just wanted to highlight a piece of research that we've just concluded. So we appointed Future of London to do some research for us around how best Brent Council can intervene in the private rented sector, because we realized from landlord licensing and so forth that there's a lot there that we're blind to, and people come to us only in crisis, and we want to be able to help before crisis point. And one of the things we realized was that the people who are poorest in the borough are also the people living in the worst type of accommodation and paying the highest rent. So a combination of all of the ills is combined for similar households, in effect. So they've now reported to us, and we are in discussions as councils do on how best we can, we can intervene, to try and alleviate, some of these problems. So, the issue of cost is without a shadow of doubt a big deal. Another area of concern, when we do our enforcement inspections, and another term for that would be our early morning raids. We find a lot of people, 30, 50 people living in one house. The landlord is terrible for doing this. But when we speak to the people we find there, they all tell us they knew what they were getting into, and they're okay with it. They actually sleep in the houses in shifts because they come from outside of the UK to work in London, and they want to spend the absolute minimum, so that they have a lot of money to take back, to their countries, and therefore they deliberately, sign up. And when I say sign up, I say that loosely. It's not because there's a tenancy agreement, to live in a place where there are mattresses, literally mattresses, all over the floor like carpets, and different people sleep there during the day, and another set come during the night. So we tackle this through our enforcement, but the point that Deputy Mayor Tom Copley made earlier is something that I've been thinking about everywhere I have the opportunity, about the government determining borough licensing. Local authorities should be able to determine where in their area needs landlord licensing, and we have evidence that where we've introduced licensing, the quality of private rented accommodation has gone up because we're able to influence so many things, and therefore even if you're paying a relatively higher rent, at least you're getting the quality of accommodation that goes with it, rather than paying a lot of money for terrible accommodation.
I don't have anything to add to that. Thank you.
Chair, just a last reflection, just to echo what Hakeem said, would be that they're the flip sides of the same coin, aren't they? Sort of affordability and supply. And another way of saying or asking this question is, why does the supply of private housing not respond to price signals? Why, when there's such an affordability problem in London, does London not build more? And that's a subject for another day. But I think this is the heart of the dilemma. But because of that, I think the supply side interventions are best in the social rented sector, and the affordability issues are the best way of describing the private rented sector. And that's why the interaction with the benefit system is so critical.
Did you want to come in, Charlie?
Yes, I kind of cut myself short a bit earlier because of my internet. I think it's stabled out now. But I think I would say two things in terms of why you need to build, like what are the barriers to supply. We should be looking at how do you address that. One of the key things is the price of land, and that's one thing that needs to be fixed so that councils have the power to compulsorily purchase and build enough genuinely affordable social homes, because it's really a challenge to actually make it's really a challenge to build those homes, because it costs more money when you're having to pay for such amount of high price for land, which has kind of shot up. I think the second thing I was going to say on the private rented sector is I think the key thing is that between 2011 and 2021, private rents in London have shot up by a quarter. And before the pandemic, private renters in London were spending about 58% of their income on rent. So it's a huge, huge problem. Clearly in terms of quality though, and clearly in terms of landlords, like we are supportive of a renters reform bill that allows people to get rid of Section 21, because a lot of the time people end up not in the private rented sector, not complaining about conditions in the home, etc., because they're scared of being evicted, and they can't enforce their rights to challenge unfair rent increases because they are worried about being evicted. So across the rented sector, there is a need to improve the rights of renters, but equally those licensing schemes and making sure that there's a kind of landlord register so that we effectively and nationally know who are landlords. That will give the councils the power to actually properly enforce standards, because at the moment it's a bit of a hit and miss situation, because a lot of the time being a landlord is as easy as easy as, for most of us who can't do it, but buy a house and rent it out, rather than going through any kind of process whereby you need to register yourself or anything like that.
Okay, thank you. And then so obviously we're in a situation where things like licensing, it's the Secretary of State that will decide whether or not a borough gets to license properties rather than the mayor or the boroughs themselves. And I just, full disclosure, it's something I very passionately think should be decided either at London level or at borough level. But are there any other measures that you would like to see implemented to deal with, I guess this is the flip side of the overcrowding issue, but are there any measures that you would like to see implemented that would affect overcrowding and quality and so on? And that's a question for all of you.
If I may, I think there needs to be a limit to conversions to HMOs. Obviously, people do things because there's a demand driving it, but demand driving it is because one-bed flats are too expensive to rent. So there's a link to everything, but there is a significant increase in houses being converted to HMOs, and not all of them are good quality. So we have leeway somewhat in licensing those, but we just in my borough at the moment, just under 4,000 HMOs are licensed. That's a lot of family homes that are now HMOs. And the people who live next to those are always writing in to complain, because of the associated issues with HMOs. So I think something needs to happen there. In my borough, we're trying to limit the growth of HMOs in certain areas because the law allows us to do it. But I think that's something that perhaps could be considered London-wide.
Beatrice or Jane, if you have any thoughts as well.
There's nothing other than what colleagues have already covered I can add to.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not, some of the things we've spoken about add a bit more detail, but I don't think anything further to add.
Okay, great, thank you. I'll hand back, Chair.
Thank you very much. We're very near the end of the meeting now, but I just wanted to pass over to Assemblymember Boff to ask a couple of questions for, I think, answer in writing.
Yes, please. I don't want to take too much of your time up, and I'm very grateful for the amount of time you have spent with us, so thank you. But I wondered if it would be possible for you to write to us to indicate how the policies and methods to address overcrowding have changed in the light of the pandemic. So don't respond now if you could write to us with that. And what opportunities are there for the conversion of existing or extension of existing homes across different tenures if we find that the pace of house building has been too slow? So if you could answer those in writing, we'd be enormously grateful in terms of informing our investigation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember Boff. And that last question is, we're going to be going into greater detail in one of our future meetings, so anything you can tell us about that would be great. I think Assemblymember Moema wants to add something to the request as well.
Yes, I did. Charlie, you said that you had some research around the data that you shared about the percentage of people who in the PRS who are now using housing benefit. If you could share that, ideally borough breakdown would be great, but anything that you have. And then similarly, that report from Hakeem from Brent would be really helpful.
So I didn't hear the report from the last bit.
Sorry, Hakeem said that Brent had commissioned a report about the future of London. So once that's ready, it'd be great to see that too.
Excellent. Yeah, I was going to chuck in a note about that as well. Essentially, all guests, we will collate the requests we've made for further information and send you a letter being clear about what we want later. So hopefully we can get more information that way. And I'm just going to hand over to Assemblymember Cooper for just a very final section and a wrap up, and then we will finish in about past.
Thanks, Chair. This is to everybody on the call, and maybe we should start with Beatrice or this time. I'm just wondering what you feel is the role of landlords in preventing overcrowding. For example, is there anything that they could do around the issue of dividing family-sized homes into smaller flats or anything like that? Do you think that would help?
Well, I think anything we can do would help. I think from Harrow perspective, as I said, our stock is quite small in terms of the numbers that we have, and also just looking at our stock profile, they tend to be kind of flats across the borough. So I think the opportunities perhaps for conversion of those are limited. And so our focus has been more around increasing supply. So, you know, an opportunity we can have to build more, we're doing that. And where we think the stock that we have is not up to scratch, is really kind of re-providing those and making sure that when we do that, perhaps we're building larger size accommodation to make more provision to address overcrowding. Cool. So we can't do certain things, but I think in terms of our stock profile, we're probably limited in terms of the number of conversions that we can do.
Right, and maybe that's different in, I'll come to Jamie first, maybe that's different in Greenwich, where I think there is a lot of very large stock, and then we'll come to Hakeem, and I know there's also large properties in Brent. So obviously this might vary borough by borough, but is this an area that you think might be worth further exploration with landlords? Jamie?
Yes, Assemblymember Cooper, for social landlords, large bedroom homes are gold dust. They are the jewels in our crown. We disproportionately lost those due to the right to buy over many years now, and so no, I wouldn't consider. I can't think of any circumstances really. I'll consider splitting up a social rented property. Yeah. For private landlords, I think there are some large bedroom private properties. I think that's quite interesting. There is an interaction here with the HMOs, because most of the deconversions, of course, go straight from the 6 or 7 bed family home straight into an HMO. Yeah. Would it be better if that they deconverted perhaps or converted to say 2, 3 or 4 bed properties in a maisonette, as opposed to 8 or 9 HMO individual bed sits? Absolutely. And maybe there is something to be thought about. What is there a grants program? Are there some incentives in planning that might incentivize that? We certainly don't do anything like that at the moment. It'd be interesting to explore that, but it's almost it's the flip side of the HMO question.
Yeah, I think in the past, when we had housing action areas and general improvement areas, a lot of housing associations did do that kind of conversion of Victorian and Edwardian street properties, where it went into a couple of flats rather than going into a house of multiple occupancy with single rooms and et cetera, et cetera. Hakeem, did you want to, how does that strike you as a possibility, rather than going from a large, semi-detached property or even a terrace with multiple bedrooms into maybe a couple of flats, incentivizing that in the planning and funding system, rather than, where we go to at the moment with landlords going straight to the HMO, as Jamie was just pointing out?
Thank you, Assemblymember Cooper. Jamie's right. I would be loath to convert a large property, and divide it up to smaller properties, because I know what the waiting list is saying. However,
I'm not asking you to do it to your stock. I'm talking just here about private landlords. Is there some way we could help? Could they help join in, alleviate the stress? I represent Merton and Wandsworth, and we had an illegal priority group sales area scheme in Wandsworth. So we've got 16,000 tenants, 16,000 leaseholders, and hundreds of thousands of family homes that were sold off. So we have almost no, and they targeted selling off street properties. So I absolutely am with you on this idea of not selling off the larger accommodation, because, you know, we've been flogging it since, 1979, we sold a whole estate in Wandsworth. So we got even in before the right to buy. So I'm totally with you on that. But do you think landlords could help?
So private landlords listen to two things: income. So that could be from rent or an incentive, or enforcement. You know, so it's either, you know, as you know, the London mayor or the government think about how to incentivize landlords to stop converting large properties to HMOs, because the reason they do that is not because they're easier to manage, it's because they bring in more money. Yeah, or you know, they introduce legislation that enforces, you know, to make sure that it doesn't happen. Those are the only two options I can think of that would make this happen.
Okay, well, that's slightly depressing, but it does also gives us potentially a very clear recommendation, which brings us on to the very, very, very last point, which I'm going to start with Charles and then go on to everybody else. Are there any other measures that we haven't mentioned yet that you think could be taken to ease overcrowding, and whether that's around carrots, sticks, incentives, legislation, you know, anything at all? So Charles, if I start with you.
So I think fundamentally the challenge, I'm going to slightly take a question with the kind of premise of the question, which is that there may be multiple things that we can do, but fundamentally we need to do the things that are effective. And the most effective one is going to be building those social homes. So there are things that you can do to address the immediate situation. There are things that you can do to kind of start playing with the stock. But frankly, because we're dealing with limited resources, limited time, limited expertise, we need to actually put our resources behind solving the problem and building the social homes. So yes, there may be very clever, lots of different ideas, but I think fundamentally, let's do the ones that's tried and tested. There were high levels of overcrowding during the war. There were high levels of poor quality stuff, and they built a ton of social housing as a result to fix it. It's been done before. We know it can be done again. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I'm going to go round in the order that you're on my screen, so no one else can see that necessarily. So the next person after Charles is going to be Jamie. Jamie, anything that we've not mentioned yet that you think might help?
And we've mentioned a lot of things, so I won't sort of list them all out again. I just reflect there's something about the overarching narrative and story about overcrowding in Britain today, and I think even amongst those on our housing register, even those in some of these terrible conditions, there's some, you know, and not such an understanding of how long the wait is, what the size of the pressure is, the depth of the housing crisis, and you know, the housing crisis manifests itself for all sorts of different people, you know, at different levels of affordability in different circumstances. But this is the real acute hard end. This is the bit that changes, you know, families' lives. This is the bit that really affects people's life chances. And I just reflect that we don't necessarily talk about it enough in the context of the wider housing crisis. This is the sharp end. And you know, that the emphasis, you know, and I echo what Charlie said about you know, the thing that really is the long-term solution to this is a social house, is social rented house building.
Yes, I mean, it is one of those distressing things that councillors and assembly members and obviously officers here, and people who've just been offered temporary accommodation and then they get stuck in it for maybe up to 5 years, and they keep coming back to you saying, but it's, you know, I'm terribly overcrowded, and there's literally nothing that you can say other than say, I'm afraid you have to wait because the supply is so limited. And it is quite heartbreaking to have to say. We're kind of coming back to some of the things that Deputy Mayor Copley said at the beginning. Beatrice, you're next on my screen, so I'll bring you in next, if I may. Any last points that you want to make that we haven't made already, or emphasise something from before?
Well, thank you. I'm probably going to be a little bit controversial, but I think something around whether it's legislation or a power to, not to force, but to encourage social tenants who are under occupying to move to smaller size accommodation. I think it's a small solution, but I think it is part of the solution. And I think them having the option to say, you know, one person in a 4-bedroom and I'm never going to move is not making effective use of what we've got. So anything we can do to push a little bit so we can use the power to ask social tenants to downsize. I think that would be helpful.
Okay, I thought we'd introduce the bedroom tax to try and incentivize some of those people, but maybe from what you're saying, it hasn't had much of an impact. So I'm going to go to Hakeem to add his final penneth worth, or £4 worth, I don't know,
Yes.
to end the discussion. Is there anything that you feel that we haven't covered or that you want to emphasise from earlier?
Yes, if I may. Thank you, Assembly Member Cooper. One, I think we haven't mentioned tackling tenancy fraud. This is, again, that's something we can do to release more council properties, because, establishing that, the people who are supposed to live there aren't, and moving them on to get people who are desperate, for social housing to move in. Incentives for home ownership. At the moment, council tenants have a right to buy, but they only have a right to buy the property they live in. And they may not actually like the property they live in, so incentivizing them to move, particularly now, through the pandemic, a lot of people have moved outside of London, so perhaps helping people to think about that would be good. And then finally, looking within our own policies. So a lot of local authorities have this like-for-like policy where, where we're moving families, due to no fault of their own, maybe it's a domestic abuse or something like that. We say, you had a 2-bed and therefore we would only give you a 2-bed, even though actually you're a 4-bed need. I think policies like that are outdated and we shouldn't have them.
Okay, so thank you. There's some additional points there as well about encouraging tenants to downsize and what more we can do to social tenants, just supply, and then the issues about, the previous things that we've done, like the cash incentive scheme, the tenants incentive scheme, and then also incentivizing people who might want to move out of London. And there's a lot of people apparently been doing that recently. How would we, make that happen, thus freeing up those properties? So a few extra points there for you, Chair, and I'll hand back immediately. And can I just take the opportunity to thank all the guests for their contributions since Deputy Mayor Copley left. I think it's been a really good discussion. Thank you.
I think so too. I really can't thank the guests enough for bringing such broad thinking into the debate and such ideas. Even if that you're not even sure they'll work yet, you're still bringing them in, and we can definitely consider everything you've told us today. Before we go, I just wish to double check. James Gleeson from the Mayor's team has been here the whole time. I just want to check if there's anything else you wanted to say or anything that has been helpful today.
Thank you, Chair. Well, just to reinforce your last point, actually, it's been really informative for me to hear about what's going on in the boroughs and to hear the ideas and proposals from the other guests. So, as well as the committee taking all that on board, we certainly will, and the policy team too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's clear it's a complex problem with probably complex solutions needed to go along with it. We will attempt to, we'll write back to you for the more details that we asked for, and we will attempt to summarise this in an output, which I think we can't formally agree to do today because of the fact we're an informal meeting, but we will follow this up as a committee. Thank you again, everybody. We've now reached the end of the question and answer session. So can I ask members to note the report and our discussion today?
Noted.
Thank you. Can we also note our work programme and the informal activity that we've done since our last meeting as well? We had a meeting directly with Londoners to hear more about their financial well-being and housing security and the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. So some of the answers we get back today will help inform outputs from that. We've then also had a background briefing with Shelter about overcrowding to help us inform the questions we asked today. And we held a session with Lord Kerslake, who is taking a look at the delivery of housing within the Greater London Authority group on behalf of the Mayor, and that was very interesting too. So can we note all of that?
Yes.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Our next meeting is a formal meeting on the 23rd of February 2022 at 2 p.m. and I have no other urgent business. So thank you, everybody, and I declare this meeting closed. Thank you again.
Thank you.